My name is Andrew Clark. I am Principal Ecologist leading on nature recovery at Merseyside Environmental Advisory Service. So briefly, we are the Council's ecological advisors, so we provide them advice on planning applications and nature projects. The Sefton Coast Nature Conservation Strategy exists already, so some of you may have heard of it, but it lapsed in 2015 and is now out of date. So this work, this talk, further consultation is about refreshing that strategy and bringing it up to date in line with some of the new legislation that we've had post-Brexit. So tonight really is just the start of a series of awareness raising talks that we're hoping to run over the next 4 weeks, and if they're successful, maybe we'll do some more. I'll be handing over to Paul shortly. So tonight's about climate change. We've got further talks on invasive species, community and volunteer involvement on the coast and management, and also a talk on birds and insects. So that's over the next 4 weeks. But tonight, first and foremost, a bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to try and stick to 10 minutes, so Paul's got longer to talk because he's got a lot more material than me. We'll have about half an hour from Paul or so, and then hopefully try and leave about 15 minutes at the end just for any questions you might have. If you haven't, please sign the attendee list and provide your email if you're happy to do so. We are recording this, and yeah, there's no fire alarm tonight. So if you fire test tonight, so if it does go off, then exit via the route you came in. Toilets are out to your right, and yeah, refreshments are over there if anybody wants a drink or a biscuit. So very briefly, we're here to talk about the Sefton Coast. You probably have some knowledge of how unique and special it is. So it has multiple layers of conservation designations, so it's designated as a site of scientific interest, a special area of conservation, and it has European level protection because it's recognised for the importance of the habitats that exist. There are 3 estuaries in the north, roughly in the middle, and in the south, so the Ribble, the Alt and the Mersey. It's a stronghold for European protected species, so things like sand lizard, natterjack toad, petalwort. But as well as all that nature conservation interest, it's also a really popular tourist destination. Residents use it regularly for dog walking or recreation, or just having a day out with your family. Or we also have strong data that shows that people come from all over the region, sometimes outside the region, just to come to the Sefton Coast. And in the south, particularly around Seaforth, it's also important for port and industry. We've got multiple different golf courses. So there's lots of landowners, lots of different interests, and lots of complexity around managing the coast. And that's what the Sefton Nature Conservation Strategy is trying to address. The Sefton Coast, site of special scientific interest. I just wanted to say briefly, just to give you an idea of where we are in terms of conditions. Somebody said earlier the coast isn't in a very good state, and no, it isn't. Less than 25% of the 34 units, so the whole of the Sefton Coast is broken down into 34 land parcels, are in favourable status in terms of nature conservation. So that's thinking about the quality of the sand dune habitat, the species that are there, and doing an overall assessment of where that's at. And as you can see, the remainder are in some level of unfavourable condition. So that's one of the big drivers why we're doing this. As I said before, we're not starting from scratch. A nature conservation strategy exists, and I'll try and get a copy on the website so it's more accessible, because I'm not sure if it's actually out there. But yeah, that does exist, and that plan dealt with all the different challenges that you can see there. So climate change, habitat fragmentation, coastal change, so coastal erosion, but other issues like kind of poor communication maybe between landowners and the local communities. So there was a number of different issues that were addressed by that strategy, and the Sefton Coast Landscape Partnership, who are a group of organisations and individuals who have an interest in the Sefton coast. It's a group that's existed for a number of decades, and it's chaired by my director at MIAS. So we did a bit of an exercise about, well, what's changed from that previous report to now. And actually, well, all of those things are still relevant, but there's also a lot more. There's a lot more things that are happening on the coast that we need to think about. So legislation's changed, the habitats and species baseline's changed. So in terms of, the condition of the habitat now, in some cases it's quite strong. In other cases, we haven't got much data at all. There are other plans and strategies that Sefton has an interest in within the borough, but also within the wider context of the Liverpool City region. And there's competing competition for land use, so I think there's a lot of things there, and that's part of the reason why we actually got the grant funding to do this refresh of the native conservation strategy in the first place. So Natural England recognised that the Sefton coast is quite challenging, there's a lot of complexity to it. So that's why we've been given some money, basically, to be able to do things like this tonight. And yeah, a lot of these are long term and they remain relevant and are generally getting more difficult to manage. So just coming back to the consultation that we're starting tonight, starting with Paul, who's going to talk about climate change on the coast and erosion rates. Then next week we are at Ainsdale Discovery Centre, and Phil Smith, who's a prominent ecologist who's been working on the Sefton coast for 50 years, is going to give a talk about invasive species management. And then the week after that, we're down in Bootle for 2 weeks. So John Dempsey, who is a prominent ornithologist, he works in communications within Green Sefton. He's also, he's a really good ecologist all round. So he'll be giving a talk on birds and insect changes on the coast, but also his role in community involvement and engagement the week after. So that's what we've got planned over the next couple of weeks. And then after that, the plan is we're going to launch an online survey and put that out to yourselves and a wider kind of mailing list of people who are interested. We're also hoping to have some young person focused events which are in planning, and we are intending to have some workshops in the autumn, dates to be confirmed. And all of that will then feed into work over the winter and next spring in refreshing that conservation strategy. And hopefully we'll be able to then rerun some of the workshops, so we'll be able to take what we've learned now through consultation, update the plan, and then feed it back to those people that are interested, hopefully sort of early springtime. And all being well, have a near published plan by next spring, summer, hopefully, that's the idea. We do have a web presence which is under development. We can send that out separately, it's not the shortest URL, and there's also a contact email there for me. But I think that probably covers everything I need to say, so I'll pass over to Paul, but happy to take any questions on that afterwards.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, my name's Paul Wisse. I'm the Development Manager in Green Sefton. Green Sefton, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the council service that looks after a large proportion of the landscape in Sefton. So the council-owned landscape, that's parks, gardens, parts of the coast, sports pitches, allotments. And we also look after street trees and other tree stock. Within my service area is flood and coastal erosion risk management, which leads me on to this talk tonight. Also, my team coordinate the Northwest Coastal Regional Monitoring Programme, and that's about collecting evidence of coastal change and some of the forcing factors that are driving that change, so we can actually better understand what is happening on the coast, why it's changing, and the trends and the scales of those changes. What I'm going to go through tonight is I'll start off a bit about what we mean by climate change, what are some of those impacts. Mitigation, adaptation, what do they mean? They're quite often mixed up and confused. A little bit look at mitigation that's already happening. Then we'll look at some of the impacts of the climate change and the adaptation options that are starting to come out about that, and then how we move on from that into the future. So what is climate change? And I know this text might be a little bit small. So what they've done is they've looked at historic trends of various variables. So on the right hand side, as you're looking at it, is temperature. On the left hand side is sea level. And they've taken a period in history of where that was fairly stable, averaged that out and considered that the mean average baseline. And then each year they compare the yearly average against that baseline to see the change in temperature or the change in sea level. So you can clearly see on the red one, the temperature graph, it's gradually been going up compared to that average. That average was from 1850 to 1900, so largely before the Industrial Revolution really kicked in and started going, before a lot of the greenhouse gases emissions were out there, so a low level. But we can actually see from that, it's about 1980 is around here where you really see those temperatures rapidly increasing. The sea level rise, that's global sea level rise from an average from 1960 to 1990, which is why pre that you've got minus figures, post that date you've got positive figures, but over this time scale, about 1870 to 2000, that's about a 15 centimetre change in global sea level rise. So the evidence is here that these things are changing. There are trends to show temperatures going up, sea levels rising. This is without any climate predictions, anything like that. This is actual data that's been recorded out there. What various organisations have done is looked at how the trends could actually change. So the International Panel for Climate Change has looked at a variety of scenarios of different emissions. This graph's for carbon dioxide, and they've looked at different amounts that could be emitted and what's the potential impact from that. So we've got a low level one called the RCP 2.6, where it goes up a bit and stabilises for the rest of the century, or the 8.5 where it exponentially shoots up. Where that goes to, we've no idea. What the scientists then do, take this, link it back to those various data sets, whether it's sea level rise, temperature, wind speed, whichever variable they're looking at, bring them together and start doing future predictions of what might happen. So this is for temperature changes, and on the right hand side we've got with that low emission scenario, and on the left hand side that's the high emission scenario. As you can see, and under all situations these will increase, a lot less on the lower emissions and exponentially on the higher emissions. You might just be able to make out a different scale of banding, and this is to do with the amount of confidence they have where the data, the temperature and the scaling is going to be. So they're saying, 95% confident we'll be in a band that wide. That's about 50% confident right down the middle, the average. So they've used these, and then that's feeding into a whole host of other assessments on what's happening with the climate. And obviously getting into this level of detail is really complicated, takes an awful lot of time, a lot of processing. There'll be thousands of runs of data models to come up with these trends. What we've done, and as part of the way we've been looking at these, is we've looked at the advice that's come out and tried to simplify these into simple statements about how the climate's going to change. So we've come up with about a dozen of these, and you'll have heard these before. There's nothing new, nothing startling in these. The hotter summer temperatures are going to go up. We're going to have more hot days in the summer. Winter's going to warm. Less rain in the summer, but when we do get rain, it's going to be more intensive, like the thunderstorms. Surprisingly, the number of rainy days in winter is going to stay the same, but then again there's going to be some increase in the amount of rain on those rainy days. So that's all about temperature, rainfall. Then we've got linked to that decrease in summer soil moisture. So again, there's less water, it's been evaporated quicker. Sea level rise, which is well documented, well presented, but linked to that, increase in extreme wave heights, and again, increase in wind speeds in the second half of the century. So a lot of these are linked together and interact with each other, which makes the process of kind of understanding the impacts of climate change quite tricky. And we'll come back to these a little bit later on. Just for that, I just want to briefly touch on climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So two phrases that are quite often bandied around, quite often misinterpreted. As you can see, there is overlap between them. So mitigation is about reducing the pollution that's causing climate change. So that's doing stuff now to reduce the emissions that we're doing. Adaptation is about how we change what we're doing to deal with how the climate's going to change. So these climate predictions, some of that stuff is already in place. All those changes we saw in the first couple of graphs going up, that was already fixed by the climate at the moment, and they're already predicted to carry on doing similar trends. So even if we stop all our emissions now, get them back to our baseline levels, the climate's still going to change. So adaptation is going to be needed, but mitigation is also going to be needed. Unless somebody comes up with an insanely cheap technology to reduce the amount of these gases in the atmosphere, we are going to see these changes happening. It's up to society and everyone else to decide on what scale those changes and impacts are going to be. In terms of mitigation, I thought I'd just touch on a couple of the things that are going on at the moment. So 4 or 5 years ago, Sefton and a number of many other councils across England and the UK declared climate emergencies. And what they're largely about is reducing the emissions of the authority in the activities that they do. So this graph down the bottom is the kind of path line to net zero, how the council reduces its emissions to almost zero. So the blue lines are perfect scenario, aiming for 2030. The orange dotted line is actually where we think we're going to be. And we've already had some positives, so agile working, largely driven by the COVID lockdown. All the staff had to work at home, we're all given the laptops. That trend has continued, so there's much less commuting and travel for staff. We need less buildings operational, so we're reducing the energy demand there. So it's actually had quite a positive impact on the council's carbon. We're getting some of the town halls retrofitted, so the heating systems are updated, the insulation's been improved, there's less wasted heat energy. LED street lighting, so switching from the sodium bulbs to LED lights. You'll have seen it happening across the borough over the last few months. Switch to green electricity. This is an interesting one because a lot of companies say we supply green electricity. Only a very few will actually confirm their sources of green electricity. A lot of them will take other sources when they need it. So there are a couple that will guarantee that you are only having green electricity from sustainable sources, but you tend to have to pay extra for those to get that commitment. So there's a few other activities going on for the council, and then you'll notice there is a gap at the end. It's almost impossible to exclude every amount of carbon emissions that you generate. And that's where we talk about offsetting, which is planting more trees, using nature to absorb the carbon dioxide that you can't actually mitigate against. Now the other one in the industry approaches, so some of you may notice this large rig bobbing around off the coast, moving up and down. What this is doing is decommissioning the gas field out there. So the gas field's pretty much come to the end of its useful life. This rig's going around decommissioning that side of stuff, but what the proposal for this is they're basically going to reverse the system and pump carbon dioxide back into all the holes they've made and use it as a carbon store. So it's linked into some of the heavy industry in the Liverpool estuary, or the chemical plants. They produce an awful lot of carbon dioxide and waste. Actually, it'll be pumped back down, stored underground, fill those gaps, and not be pumped out into the atmosphere. So an interesting proposal, interesting option for reusing this industry from the past that's partly cause the problem. Actually, they're looking at a way they can use it to mitigate it getting any worse in the future. So that's only a couple of the bits I just wanted to touch on that side of things. What I'm going on to now is how we've approached looking at climate change within council, particularly within Green Sefton. As I said earlier, it's a massively complex area. The scale of it is immense. If you try and tackle global climate change, you can't do it. An individual can't do it, the council couldn't do it, the country can't do it. So what the approach we've taken is trying to break it down for staff to look at their areas of work, to try and get them to understand what these changes could mean for them to do their job on a day-to-day basis. So it's taken it down to a very low level. From that, we can bring all that together and start building it back up again to look at strategies and plans to tackling the number of these things. To make it simpler, we came up with a list of questions. Focusing on a specific area of work, just work your way through these. What are those climate change risks we talked about earlier are you going to consider? You can do one, you can do several. But what do you think might happen? It's such a simple question, what do you think might happen? But the scale of climate and all that risk is obviously puts a lot of people off thinking about it. It's very hard to get people to think into the future about what the risks might be. But if we can break it down to what do you think might happen? A lot of these things we have had experience of, maybe not to the same degree, but we've had some extreme droughts in the summer, we've had thunderstorms, we've had snow in the winter, we've had lockdowns where people haven't been out of their houses, we've had floods all over the country. So there's a lot of things that are already happening that we can use to think about, oh, actually, what might happen under this circumstance. And then, what are the negative consequences? That's the thing most people focus on with climate change, and it's clearly one of the biggest concerns. But there may be some positive consequences as well from climate change, and we need to explore those as well. Is there a benefit that we can take out of these things? And then what would you do differently to help deal with it? How do you need to change the way you work? So it does break it down into a more simple process for people to look at the potential impacts of climate change. So the first one I'm going to just go through is about sea level rise. Under all of those emission scenarios, the sea level is going to rise. We've already seen evidence it's rising. Current guidance we're being given from DEFRA and the Environment Agency is around about a metre sea level rise in 2100. So any plans and strategies we're looking at, we have to build that in to our mapping and our understanding of risk. So, if we have sea level rise of 1 metre, all the red is the land that would be below that sea level. So, large portion of West Lancs will be below sea level. A lot of Sefton's actually above sea level, but we have flooding up in Marside, the back of Southport, the back of Ainsdale, and the back of Formby. What this data set doesn't take into account is any coastal offences, anything that's there to protect the water moving. So we do have the Crossings pumping station up here, taking several watercourses out there, and the Alt pumping station down here that sits on the River Alt, which stops water flowing back up those channels. We do have defences up, particularly on the northern end, that stop the water coming in. And we've got dunes and some ad hoc defences down the southern end. So, but this could happen. If those defences fail, breach, can't be maintained, this area of land is below that tide level. One of the most interesting things from the council point of view is this northern part of Sefton's cut off from the rest of the borough. All your roads, all your rail will be underwater. And that opens a whole host of questions of how do you operate in that area? How does everyone operate in that area? How do you get to work? How do the shops get the food in? How do you get medicines to hospital, to school? You know, the challenges that presents an organisation like Sefton is immense, but also everyone else, your day-to-day routine is completely thrown in the air. So there is some real risk of big impacts of this type of stuff. And this is just sea level rise. So obviously within that, there's huge costs potentially to manage that risk. The expectation is bigger coastal defences will be built. It'll be pumped, it'll be drained, but that's all got a cost associated with it. And it's a big cost as well. So that's kind of a big scale one. And you can do this mapping yourself, Climate Central. It comes around in the papers every couple of months. You'll see maps like this for different parts of the country. You can go on their website, you can do a slider changing from 10 centimetre sea level rise to 5 metres, 8 metres, and that's when Sefton doesn't exist under 8 metres sea level rise. But you can have a play around with that and just test almost that sensitivity. Coming back to a bit more of a more local level. So again, looking at coastal defences across Sefton coast, sea level rise and increased risk of extreme wave heights. So waves, the amount of energy in a wave is dependent on the depth of water. So if you've got deeper water, sea level rise, you can have bigger waves that have more energy in them. What that energy does is redistribute sediment in the system. So that'll move the sand around, it'll move the mud, it'll move stones, whatever your base is, it will start mobilising a bit more. So our coastline at the moment's working with the energy system it's got at the moment. We've got erosion around Formby, accretion to the north and south. If that energy environment changes, you'll expect that pattern of sediment distribution to change as well. So we can see more reduction in beach levels, more erosion of the dunes, loss of the salt marsh. That leads to increased damages of flooding and coastal erosion. Budgets to maintain and manage that side of things, repairs, cleanups. And again, there's that expectation that protection will be provided. What we don't know with that is actually where will the sediment go? Will it go offshore, be lost? Will it be distributed to the places where it's already accreting? Will it go somewhere else further up the coast? Will Blackpool benefit? So there's some unknowns about actually what will happen with this sediment. Will it reach another equilibrium, reach balance, and the coastal roughly stay where it is, or will it continue to change and evolve? One of the ways we're looking to adapt is working more with the natural processes, using what nature's trying to do, working with it, trying to harness that, rather than putting concrete structures in, spending huge amounts of money trying to put hard protection in. Hard protection relies on a beach in front of it. If that beach disappears, it just falls over, unless you build a bigger structure and a bigger structure. Current estimates of concrete seawalls are about £20,000 a linear metre. That very quickly adds up, and that's probably even higher now with all the cost increases, and in 100 years I wouldn't hate to guess how much that would cost. So it's really big money to put coast protection. So just a bit more moving down the coast. So this is north of Formby Golf Club and the Ainsdale Dunes. You probably can't quite make them out, but there's a series of coloured lines on here. And we've had consultants look at potential erosion of the dune system. And these are some of their predictions that they put on there. What we see is the coast continues to erode, but the actual area where the hinge point, the extent of erosion, it does change. It starts getting a wider front that's being eroded. And then we also see that those rates of erosion increase towards the end of the century. And that's where you're getting the increased wind speeds, the higher sea levels, more energy coming into the system. And we'd potentially, again, get that increased mobile sand. Again, that's mirrored across Formby frontage. On this model, potentially up to another 350 metres of the dunes lost. We've already lost 400, 500 metres from its widest point. In terms of habitats, when you start getting coastal squeeze, you've got a town at the back. That dune habitat's getting squeezed, you've got trees as well in there. There's less space for nature to do what it wants to do. Less space for the dunes to act as a coastal defence, less space for the species and habitats that rely on the dunes and the trees. Predictions are still suggesting that the southern end, the Old Carl Rifle Range, there might still continue to be some accretion there. So some of that sediment may be accumulating in that area. Right at the northern end, marsh side, where we have the salt marsh, again, starting to bring into question what's the lifespan of the salt marsh. Salt marsh is a great coastal defence. If you've ever been to Southport on a stormy day at high tide, you see the waves crashing up against the seawall, to the south the waves rolling in. You look north, it's almost flat calm, there's a ripple. So all that wave energy has been taken out by the plants in the salt marsh. So it is a fantastic coastal defence. But again, once those energy systems are increasing, that sediment starts mobilising and being moved away. This will gradually erode. Again, that will lead to increased maintenance costs as the waves start impacting more on the coastal road that runs around there. Also lead to drainage issues. So we have surface water drains that drain out onto the coast. If our sea level's higher for longer, there's less time for the surface water to drain out, so it backs up, potentially causes inland flooding. There's also saline intrusion. So as the sea level's high, it's pushing down, you actually get ingress into the groundwater of saline. So you can actually, there's a long data set from the Ainsdale dunes of groundwater monitoring. You can actually see it move up and down with the tides as that pressure from the water pushes the groundwater in. But under the sea level scenarios, you can get more saline coming into that groundwater, so then potentially knocks on to your building foundations, species growing in the area, salt water on plant roots and all this type of stuff. So there's potentially some big impacts in these areas, and more groundwater flooding as there's less space for the actual rainfall to spread out. So one of the other areas we've been looking at, again, sea level rise, is the coastal visitors. So we've got higher sea levels, the beach is covered for longer, which means there's less space for people visiting the coast. That'll be, for the council, we have parking on the beach at Ainsdale, so there'll be less parking. For the council, there's potentially less income as a result of that. More conflicts with birds, so as the birds are pushed higher up the coast as the tide's coming in, people are using the same space, the birds are disturbed, they're impacted on, stresses them out. And then people are forced into the dunes, so you get more impact on the dune habitats. You can come to the Sefton coast on a glorious hot sunny day, walk in the dunes and not see a soul, step on the beach and it's heaving. But if all those people are suddenly forced into the dune because there's no beach, no space on the beach because the tide's in, that dune system and everything in there is going to struggle and get stressed and impacted, trampled, and you get that knock-on consequence of sea level rise, but actually displacing people into a different area. And again, how do we adapt to that? Do we look at bringing people to the coast in different ways when they can't park on the beach? It's something we're already trying to encourage them to do, but people just like to rock up in a car because it's convenient, it's easy. Do we restrict access to the beach at high tide to give the birds more space and a break from being disturbed? And do we have more defined access routes through the coast? At the moment you can pretty much roam where you like. But actually, do we actually need to go back to some of the management techniques we were doing 30, 40 years ago? Fenced paths, direct people to where you want them to go. So there's lots of things, different consequences from a single type of impact that we do need to explore and understand. So I thought I'd move on to temperature. So it's not obviously directly linked to a coastal erosion, but there's a lot of impacts that do have an effect on the coastal defences. So I thought I'd explore that. So as we said, the temperatures are going to increase a couple of degrees, but it does make a significant difference. And this is average temperatures, not the extremes. And you can go on to, I think it's the BBC website, you can go on there, you can put your postcode in and bring up the climate scenarios for your own location as well and see what the changes are. So again, coastal defences, sand dune coast, we're looking at those hot summer temperatures, the increased number of hot sunny days, decrease in rain, decrease in soil moisture. So that's going to stress the dune vegetation. It's less water for them to grow, it's much hotter, more will be evaporated, we potentially get more visitors coming in. you expect some of that vegetation to die off, get trampled, destroyed, struggles to recover. We're going to get more mobile sand. If you've been down to Formby, you'll see they've already got some large mobile sand sheets that are moving quite quickly. You could expect to see that on much larger areas of the coast. As they blow inland, there's a potential to impact on infrastructure, roads, properties, drainage systems, and that will result in the loss of some of the dune habitats. You get less fixed habitats, more of the mobile habitats. But on the other side, one of the potential positives, actually more of that sand may blow inland, providing a store of sediment for the future. So as the coast changes, the roads, there's actually more material available to maintain the beach or the dunes. And again, open dune habitat is one of the rarer habitats on the coast. It's largely very fixed habitat, so there is a kind of a trade-off there, and it's just to what scale it could go through to being open bare sand. And again, it's how we work with those natural processes. We know we could plant Christmas trees, we can stop it, but actually, is that what we want to do? Do we want to encourage it to do something different, work with it a bit more sensitively to get the habitats and the sand to where we want them to be? Another one, coastal defences, so the hard defences. We've got hard defences at Southport here and down at Crosby as well. And again, we're looking at those increased summer temperatures and the hot sunny days. What we can see is as the concrete expands in the heat, it can buckle, it can crack, it can lift. And you can already see this in Southport, just north of the pier. There's a section where it does lift on really hot sunny days, and you get a bit of a point in the promenade. But that does reduce the lifespan of those defences, increase the risk of failure, trip hazards, all this type of stuff, more maintenance, more cost to repair and maintain them. And actually, you'd expect that to expand, become more common, more frequent across all the defences. So how do we adapt to that? We could look at different joint fillers. So we have concrete slabs with a rubbery filler between them that's designed to compress as they expand. Actually, is there a more squishy one, or do we have a wide gaps or more gaps? Do we, when we actually come to rebuild defences, if we do we design them in a different way that's more sensitive to that? Or do we totally move away from hard defences and move back to natural systems? And that, for a town like Southport or Crosby, would be a massive decision to make. And there's lots of pros and cons against that. Understanding how a natural system will evolve and change is very difficult compared to concrete structure, where people have confidence. I've got a bit of rock there, nice bit of concrete, it's not going anywhere. Actually, is it the best system for the future? We don't quite know. So it does really pose some interesting questions when you start looking right into the future. What are the best options going forward? Another one, coastal visitor management. Again, it's all these hot sunny days, lovely time to come and visit the beach, more litter. We need to manage more people, there's more risk, more people getting into trouble. All our coast is designated, so they're actually doing more impact and damage to the designated sites. And we need more resources to manage this. So this photo is just after one of the lockdowns from COVID, and everyone decided to come to the coast from everywhere and decided they could just leave the rubbish wherever they liked. And there was tons of rubbish across the coast that the council and the other agencies had to clear up. Again, particularly that issue, is changing society's approach to disposing of the waste. See, the most effective way of recycling is taking it home and putting it in your own bin, which is all separated and everything. This stuff will just go on a skip to a landfill. No one's got the resource to sort this, filter this, so there is a move to that. Some more organisations, I think National Trust, if you go to their site, you probably won't find a bin there. But other agencies haven't gone down that route yet, and it is a trade-off. If you get rid of all the bins, are people just going to throw litter everywhere? Whereas if there is a bin, they obviously pile it up next to the bin. And obviously no one read the sign on the bin that says please take it home if the bin's full. So there is, these other impacts that we do see on these nice hot sunny days, and if we get more of those, actually this takes an awful lot of effort and time to clear up. People expect the coast to be pristine, actually, but when you're dealing with this scale of rubbish and litter, it's almost impossible to keep on top of. So again, hot sunny days, decrease in rain, decrease in soil moisture, more dry vegetation, increased fire risk. We do get several fires on the dunes every year. Some have been deliberately started, some are bottles, other rubbish left lying around, cigarette butts dropped. More dry vegetation, it will very rapidly burn through that. Dunes do tend to recover quite quickly, but again, if the scale of material, dead material there is increased, actually these fires could be even harder to put out, even bigger, spread further, happening more often, more pressure on the resources that are trying to put these out. Obviously, whilst the plants are pretty resilient, marron grass and such like will grow back pretty quickly, an awful lot of the animals and species that live there will die. There is that increased risk to properties in the area that back onto the dune systems. To date, I'm not aware that we've ever had a canopy fire in the pine trees down at Formby, but if that did take, that would be very difficult to put off, and the properties are right in there as well. Again, this was one where initially it was very hard for whoever put this one in our assessment to come up with, well, what can you do about it? Other than have more people on standby, ready, more Bowsers dotted around the coast. It's about education, telling people not to throw litter, don't have barbecues, don't throw your cigarette butts. Or do we go down the route of having controlled burns? So other places around the world have controlled burns to get rid of the dead material. Is that something that's even feasible on a designated site when you know you're going to impact a whole host of species? So it is a really interesting one. Consequence. The other thing we do tend to find is on those really hot sunny days, people go a bit weird and go out and start fires. It's funny, there's certain people who come out hot sunny day, right, let's have a fire. Natterjack toads, so one of the key species, the famous species on the Sefton coast. Again, all those hot summer days reducing water moisture and such like. They need slacks within the dune systems to breed. They have a breeding cycle once they lay eggs, it's about 4 weeks until the toadlets come out of the pools. However, if there's increased temperature, less moisture in the system anyway, are those pools going to last for 4 weeks? Is their breeding success gradually going to go down and down and down until we lose them completely? Are we actually going to be confused when the breeding season is? If the temperatures are increasing, are they going to come out earlier? You know, I think someone had a report of one in December coming out because it was so warm that one year. You know, so they're coming out, not finding their mates and stuff like that, going back into hibernation and starving effectively because they're using up all their energy resources going in and out. Consequence, we could potentially lose natterjack toads from the Sefton coast. And there was a study done about 10 years ago on one of the previous predictions that came to that conclusion that they would die out on the Sefton coast. But actually in Cumbria, the population would increase. So as a species, actually, its range is changing a bit. Or there's an increased cost to provide the habitat for that species. Actually, there has been management in the past where you go and dig scrapes for the toads to maintain that breeding population. Actually, you do need to do that more often, dig deeper holes, actually bring water in to fill the holes up. So there's a whole host of questions there. In terms of that adaptation, that's potentially how we manage the sites on the coast, change out the way we manage them. Or actually we accept we're going to lose them. Is the investment to maintain that species enough? And it's one of the big questions Chris Packham always asks about the giant panda. You know, if China wasn't funding them, would they have died out years ago? Because they're in such a narrow evolutionary niche. The other thing we need to consider is actually the toads may adapt to the changing climate. They may actually be able to start breeding earlier, have their breeding season earlier. And that's something we just don't know how they will adapt to that change. Is there going to be a suitable environment for them to breed, but actually at a different time of the year? It's a slim chance, because most wisdom says the climate's changing too quick for species to adapt. But there is a chance that actually they could find a slightly different niche to fill. So that it's just kind of a touch on a whole variety of the different risks and impacts we've started looking at. You could look at every aspect of management on the coast, go through these in detail, and bring up thousands of these things. And that's a process that we're continuing to do. So we've touched on adaptation as a way of dealing with climate change, but actually it's changing more the thinking to adaptive pathways. And what this is recognising is that one single action isn't going to solve the impact you're trying to deal with. You need to continually change the way you do things in response to the conditions you're facing. So the climate's going to change, and things may change in ways we don't expect. Actually, we need to be able to continue to assess that and change the way we respond to those to get the outcomes that we need. And this is a process that needs to continue forevermore, almost. We continually react and respond to what the climate and the conditions are doing. I'll briefly touch on a couple of projects that we're currently working on that's starting to look into this. So we're involved in a project called the Alt Catchment Natural Flood Management. So this is looking at the River Alt from source to sea, and it's looking at using natural flood management measures to reduce the risk of flooding across that catchment. And that's from leaky dams, creating detention ponds, swales, rain gardens, all the way to one of the projects down at Hightown Beach is where we're looking at a beach and dune recharge project. So it was done back in 2011 when a large amount of material was brought into the area, put on the beach to restore the dunes. Most of that material has been moved out of the system now, so we're looking at similar options again. But we're looking, can we bring material in from much local? The Alt River Channel actually been infilling over the last decade or so we're doing some checks to see if the material that's in the Alt Channel right next to the beach is suitable to be brought back onto the beach. We're doing a lot of ecological surveys because all the site is designated as well. We're looking at, actually, do we need some control structures to manage how the sediment's moving around on that beach as well? Do we need to hold it in certain areas to just make it last a bit longer? We're also looking at where we actually place that sediment. It might be more beneficial to place it in the dunes rather than in the beach. So there's a lot of different options we're looking at. We're working up business cases at the moment, and hopefully within a couple of years this project might get funding to go ahead. The other one we're involved in is a project called Our Future Coast, which is across the northwest coast, led by the North Wales Coastal Group. And this is looking at innovative ways of working with natural processes. How can we use the natural systems to maintain coast protection? How do we work with nature? It's about exploring and trialling new techniques, new ways of monitoring, new ways of understanding how these systems work, collecting the evidence to prove that they do work. And that's the real problem at the moment. The evidence to demonstrate that these work as compared to a hard coastal offence just isn't there. We don't tie up at the moment. The sites we're working on is predominantly Formby dunes and linked to Blackpool dunes as well. Formby, we're really keen to understand what triggers those dynamic sand sheets to evolve and develop, what climatic conditions or environmental conditions have led for one area to suddenly blow in, but next to it doesn't change. At Blackpool dunes, we're actually looking at putting some interventions on the beach. Can we direct the windblown sand to where it's going to be most useful? Is that a useful management technique for the future to fill in low spots where a flood pathway may exist, to deflect it into gaps and such like to build up habitat for certain species? Again, this project's underway, and it's over the next couple of years where this work will really start gaining a bit of momentum. So just in summary, the scale of the change is unprecedented to anything that we've faced before, and a lot of the change we don't even know what it's going to be at the moment, so it is a continually evolving picture. Everyone needs to be involved in this. You can't expect, the council can't do it, The organisations can't do it, the government can't do it, it needs everyone to contribute to it. When I talked earlier about the council's carbon emissions and the council's route to net zero, that only accounts for 3% of the borough of Sefton's carbon emissions. So even if the council hits net zero, still 97% of people's houses, or the businesses, or the cars, that actually is contributing, and ideally, as a community, we need to get that down as well. There's no single solution that'll solve it all, and any solutions that we come up with will probably change over time as well. We need to be flexible. And you know, the impacts, they're interlinked, they can compound each other, make each other worse. And something you may think have no relevance to one thing, actually, when you delve into it, does have a real consequence of that side of things. In terms of some of the next steps, we need to get this way of thinking embedded in our strategies and plans moving forward, and that become normal business for the council and the organisations. We can't continue to think, oh, there's something in the future, we'll plan for that in the future. Actually, we need to start building it into the way we work now. We need to continue those reviews and assessments, as we're saying, those adaptive pathways. It's going to continue to change. We need to be able to respond and understand that. We need to continue to engage and talk with others to raise awareness, get them on board with these approaches and the decisions and the challenges that we face. There we go. Any questions?
Thank you, Paul. So